Alle sammen. Veldig glad for å se at så mange har kommet hit I kveld. Vi har stort sett norskspråklig publikum her, men også noen engelskspråklig, og vi har en distingvert gjest fra USA, så vi kommer til å holde oss til engelsk I kveld. So I will switch to English, and warm welcome to you all. And my name is Johannes Enstad. I'm a researcher at the Institute for Social Research, where I am directing a project on contemporary anti-Semitism in Europe. And this event is organized by me and my project in cooperation with Kos og Kaos, the Nordic Jewish Network. The purpose of the meeting is to address the issue of anti-Semitism, the threats to open Jewish life, and the challenges that this poses for democratic societies like our own. So I hope that tonight's talk and conversation can be interesting and useful for you. To help us through it all, we have tonight's moderator, Cathrine. Trump is an author of 2 books dealing with the far right and also a literary critic, and previously worked as an editorial assistant in Klassekampen. So I give the word to you, Cathrine. Thank you.
Thank you. As Johannes said, we have a tight schedule. We will hear from a lot of people, and my main job will be to ensure that everybody gets to say something, and also that you're all just hanging in there. So I will just have to announce a slight change in program, because the speaker from Denmark, Jakob Feldt, unfortunately couldn't make it to Oslo today. But instead, Cathrine Thorleifsson will talk. The setup for this evening is as follows. We will start with 3 talks. The 3 speakers I will introduce you shortly. And then shortly after 8 o'clock, the speakers will be joined by a panel of 4 who will give their response, and then we will open for a wider discussion. So our main speaker today is Jeffrey C. Alexander, who is Professor Emeritus in Sociology at Yale University. Alexander is an influential sociologist, widely known for his work on culture, politics, and social theory. He has written a number of influential books, including The Civil Sphere, which explores processes of inclusion and exclusion in democratic societies, as well as Trauma, a social theory, where he examines how communities deal with collective trauma, such as the Holocaust. The talk he will be giving tonight is entitled The Re-Emergence of Antisemitism, Inverting the Lessons of the Holocaust Before and After Gaza. After this, we will hear from Johannes Enstad, whom you've met before. He is a senior researcher at the Institute for Social Research, where he directs the project Comparing Histories of Antisemitism in Contemporary Europe, which is funded by the Research Council of Norway. In his research, Enstad has also focused on Russian history, right-wing extremism, as well as the role of morality in politics. And the last speaker out is Cathrine Thorleifsson, who is an associate professor at the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo. She was also the head of the Norwegian government's Commission on Extremism, who issued a report this year on strategies for preventing and countering extremism. In her academic work, Thorleifsson has specialized in nationalism and ethnic identities, as well as far-right movements. And she has conducted fieldwork in the Middle East and studied both Arabic and Hebrew. Now I will just invite Jeffrey Alexander up, and we'll give the floor to you.
Thank you for inviting me here. I usually don't speak in floodlights like this. It was because the Holocaust came to be construed as the most heinous evil ever perpetrated in the history of humankind that anti-Semitism was forced underground. Yet memories fade, whether collective or individual. Germany and Japan are no longer vicious military dictatorships, but thriving democracies at the heart of new Western wars, hot and cold, against Russia and China. The anti-Nazi sentiment that fueled public prohibitions against anti-Jewish expressions were once spontaneous and ferocious prohibitions, they seem now mostly labored, and while highly organized and well-funded, they are more ratiocinative effort than gut reactions. In Europe, leaders of, quote, post-fascist parties are becoming prime ministers. In America, once and possibly future presidents meet with demagogues who whitewash Nazism and deny the Holocaust. No matter the centrality of the Holocaust in textbooks and museums, neither the brutal murder of 6 million nor the vicious regime that conceived it have much to do with lived experience 3 generations on. But it's not only that Nazism and its primary victim are no longer vivid memories. It's also that they have long ceased to be central actors in the collective traumas that animate and define the liberal consciousness of Western societies. In the middle and later post-war period, new social movements powerfully projected traumas of their own, creating wrenching dramas about forms of human suffering that had nothing to do with Nazis and Jews, at least not literally, not in the historical sense of who did what to whom in the years between 1933 and 1945. Courageous struggles against Western colonialism captured the world's attention, creating new categories of historical actors who gradually morphed into contemporary activists fighting globalization. There has been the riveting struggle against internal colonialism, decades of anti-racist movements on behalf of black victims of slavery and indigenous peoples. There has been a revolutionary feminist movement, which also triggered explosive struggles against heterosexual normativity. Not to mention an apocalyptic environmental movement against climate change. Finally, and most directly relevant to the story I'm telling here, there has been the creation of 2 new historical actors. First, the establishment of Israel, whose violent creation sharply exacerbated anti-Jewish hatred in the Arab Muslim world. Second, the emergence of the Palestinian, a newly defined category of Arab people that over the last 5 decades has struggled, sometimes violently, sometimes politically, and always symbolically, for recognition of its right to exist as an independent territorial entity, not only alongside of, but often in place of the Israeli state. The, quote, lessons of the Holocaust that crystallized in the middle of the 20th century not only significantly undermined anti-Semitism in the Western world, but created a hypersensitivity to ethnic/religious violence more broadly, a structured repulsion, a demand for immediate intervention that expanded and imaginatively upgraded the civil sphere to a putatively global level. While the phrase "never again" initially emerged in response to the anti-Jewish mass murder, it quickly took on a broader meaning, demanding that the moral consciousness of the so-called civilized world more closely approximate Kant's utopia of a supranational cosmopolitanism that is necessary to ensure perpetual peace. It's critical to understand that the creation of such a striking moral upgrading had little to do with the process of rational judgment at the heart of Kant's philosophy, which such philosophers as Rawls and Habermas extended well into the late 20th century. The shift happened because of an aesthetic and moral experience, the outcome of participating in what I call a trauma drama that triggered catharsis and moral growth in the manner of Aristotelian tragedy. The killing of the Jews was, in the beginning, viewed, quote, merely as one more, if enormously larger, mass murder, subsumed under other vicious atrocities that the Nazis had committed during World War II. In years that followed, as the Nazis' mass murder became transformed into the Holocaust, and it took a long time for that to happen, the genocide of the Jews came to be defined as the major takeaway from the war itself. The trauma drama was achieved by personalizing the victims of the mass murder, a process that not only allowed, in a rational sense, but emotionally compelled identification with the suffering Jewish victims. The pathetic photographs of concentration camp survivors in their striped uniforms became icons of human suffering. The melodramatic story of a girl named Anne Frank broke the collective hearts and minds of parents and children around the Western world, becoming required reading in grade school classrooms, communicating the searing tragedy of ethnic violence in an aesthetic manner, infinitely more powerful than logical argument. The thousands of televised documentaries, miniseries, and Hollywood movies from Exodus to Sophie's Choice transformed an historical event into an epical evil. The Holocaust became not just an episode in history, but a legendary myth about human suffering, a spool of film continuously replayed, a tragedy that demanded what Nietzsche called an eternal return. Paradoxically, the very process of dramatic personalization had the effect of generalizing and abstracting the, quote, Holocaust. The legend became a free-floating culture structure of injustice, directing public attention beyond the experience of specifically Jewish suffering to ethnic and racial violence as such wherever and whenever it applied. When this narrative of injustice was applied to a suffering group, it created in the minds and hearts of global audiences an experience of heinous and genocidal evil, triggering overwhelming feelings of pity that compelled identification. It created new victims and perpetrators of a heinous moral crime that could never again be denied or overlooked, but rather demanded conscience-bound attention and righteous intervention. What this generalizing process meant was that in a figurative cultural sense, the Holocaust was taken away from the Jewish people. It became a universal trope that other non-Jewish groups, even anti-Jewish groups, now evoked to demand protection and justice for themselves. Jews were no longer in the privileged position of being the only victim of a Holocaust. And Nazis were no longer the only perpetrators of genocide. For the 1960s anti-war movement in the US and Europe, America, spelled with a phonetic German K, was committing genocide with its napalm bombing against the Vietnamese. Today, the Russians are widely accused of committing genocide in the Ukraine. The US and Russian nations are not indicted merely for making war, but more broadly indicted for committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocidal crimes that require universal condemnation, intervention, reparations, and restitution. The lessons of the Holocaust had allowed Jewish people for the first time in Western history to be incorporated into Western civil spheres. Yet the very success of this process meant that Jewish people were no longer able to persuasively occupy the cultural category of victim. The trauma drama moved on, naming and shaming violent ethnic and religious oppression everywhere. And demands for recognition and civil incorporation proceeded apace to other groups. Audiences around the world were repulsed by the colonial persecution that the British unleashed around the world and that the French unleashed against Algerians and Vietnamese, by the gross brutality of racist Southern white sheriffs against black civil rights demonstrators, by the sadistic crucifixion of gay men, by the dead bodies of migrant children washed ashore when their overcrowded and leaking ships capsized in the open seas. There is more to the paradoxical nature of the lessons of the Holocaust than the fact that its universalization generated new non-Jewish categories of suffering victims. While the lessons of the Holocaust are universalized, for the audience looking on, they are particularized, at least they often are particularized, for the victims. Groups who occupy this newly universal victim category understand their own situation often in an anti-universalistic way. Subjected to despotic oppression because of their ethnicity, religion, or race, they believe they have the right to fight back, quote, by any means necessary, as the Black Panthers put it, to dislodge the perpetrator and to protect themselves. Savagery can and must be practiced on both sides. Thus, the nihilistic moral of Quentin Tarantino's 2009 Holocaust revenge movie, Inglourious Basterds. Generalizing the morale of the Holocaust triggers a sense, in other words, often, of particularistic entitlement, generating the kind of relentless tit-for-tat violence that undermines cosmopolitan solidarity, incites depersonalizing animosities, and undermines, rather than reinforces, the prospects for perpetual peace. Such an inversion of universalism has, in my view, been etched into the collective identities of both the Israeli and the Palestinian peoples. Jewish settlements remained in the centuries that followed Muslim conquest of the Middle Eastern region that the Romans had named Palestine. This Jewish remnant grew exponentially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in reaction to the burgeoning backlash against Jewish incorporation in Europe and Russia. Organized Zionism, which emerged in the wake of the Dreyfus scandal, called for the creation of a Jewish state, and the Balfour Declaration in 1917 made it official imperial policy. There were to be two states, one Arab-Muslim, the other Jewish, side by side. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. Its provinces transformed into French and British colonies. Muslims were traumatized by their dwindling power and felt extraordinarily vulnerable to what seemed to be yet another, this time more definitive, crusade. On the very day that the UN designated the birth of two states, Israel was attacked by four massively larger, if organizationally much weaker, Arab armies. Amid the chaotic conditions and competing political, ethnic, and religious ambitions, Israel declared its independence. Zionist fighters fought pitched battles against local Palestinians and Arab soldiers. By the end, 700,000 Palestinian Arabs evacuated their ancestral home, and soon after, about the same number of Jews in North Africa and the Middle East abandoned theirs, coming to Israel. Jewish soldiers individually and the emerging Jewish nation collectively experienced this birth struggle as a matter of life and death. We, the Jewish Israelis, the Israeli psychiatrist Dan Barone recalled, saw ourselves as surrounded by enemies and having to struggle physically and mentally for our lives and survival. Feelings of compassion for displaced Palestinians who were equally endangered were cast aside, end quote. Experiencing the mass extermination in Europe energized the struggling Jewish state's sense of itself as uniquely the victim. According to the trauma drama frame, a military response to the Palestinian problem was the only way out. Only military strength could prevent Jewish defilement and death from ever happening again. The tit-for-tat, anti-cosmopolitan mentality is revealingly displayed in the dark and self-justifying elegy that Israeli army leader Moshe Dayan composed on the eve of the 1956 war in response to the murder by the Palestinians of a colleague, soldier colleague. The speech has only recently been recovered in full, and it has long been memorialized as a synodoche for the depersonalizing brutality of that time and now of ours. These are Dayan's words. A generation of settlement are we, and without the steel helmet and the maw of the cannon, we shall not plant a tree, not build a house. Our children shall not have lives to live if we do not dig shelters. And without the barbed wire fence and the machine gun, we shall not have a path nor drill for water. The millions of Jews, annihilated without a land, peer out at us from the ashes and command us to build a land for our people. This post-Holocaust apologia, as I would describe it, for violent settlement ends with a chilling recognition that defending the new Israeli nation will undermine any chance for a peaceful resolution. Quote, beyond the furrow that marks the border, Diane declares, lies a surging sea of hatred and vengeance, yearning for the day when we heed those who call for us to lay down our arms. Israel's sense of entitling victimhood deepened after the near-death experiences of the 1967 and 1973 Arab wars against it. After the first of these, the leading labor liberal Abba Eban equated returning the newly captured West Bank territory with returning to the barbed wire enclosures of Auschwitz. After the second, Likud Prime Minister Menachem Begin made even more prominent use of Holocaust imagery, warning time and time again about the, quote, return of Auschwitz. In response to threats from Palestinians and Arab nations, quote, no one came to save us, Begin declared, referencing the historical Holocaust. Neither from the East nor from the West, the lessons he drew from this experience were ominous, quote, we have sworn a vow, we the generation of extermination and rebirth, never again will we put our nation in danger. It's our nation, right? It's a particularism. Never again will we put our women and children and those whom we have a duty to defend, if necessary at the cost of our lives, in range of the enemy's deadly fire. Such anti-universalizing, quote, lessons of the Holocaust inspired the settler movement that colonized the West Bank, erecting roadblocks and barbed wire fences around the living spaces and lives of native Palestinians. In 2005, when Israel dismantled 25 settlements in Gaza, IDF soldiers were met by sobbing children wearing yellow shirts, sobbing Jewish children, settlement children, asking with raised hands, have you come to take us to the gas chamber? And by settler activists wearing Auschwitz-like striped uniforms in protest. In 2009, Yad Vashem, the Jerusalem museum dedicated to memorializing Holocaust memory, fired an employee who publicly compared the trauma of Jewish Holocaust survivors with the trauma experienced by the Palestinian people. Acknowledging, quote, there are people who lived on this land before us. The employee had dared to explain to people visiting Yad Vashem that just as, quote, the Holocaust moved us to establish a Jewish state, so, quote, the Palestinian nation's trauma is moving it to seek self-determination. The construction of this particularistic, dehumanizing dimension of Israeli collective identity, of course, did not happen in a vacuum. The universalizing ambitions of post-Holocaust morality were just as strikingly inverted on the Palestinian side. A few months, for example, after the highly publicized incident at Yad Vashem, the United Nations Relief Agency announced plans to introduce Holocaust history lessons in some of its 221 schools that it administered in Gaza. Palestinian political and religious authorities immediately denounced the plan as an effort to spread Jewish propaganda. One Hamas leader described the effort as, quote, marketing a lie and spreading it, declaring that teaching Palestinian children that the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews would be nothing less than, quote, a war crime. In fact, anti-Jewish feeling among Arab Muslims was inflamed long before the Nazi mass murder had become transformed in the West into a world historical event. After the defeat and dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of the First World War, fantastical images of Jews as perpetrators of the Arab devastation began to widely circulate. Beyond the perfidy of the region's new British and French colonizers, Arab Muslims saw the Dracula-like power of money-hungry and blood-seeking Jewish puppeteers. Out of the pride and prejudice of traditional Islam, Islamism emerged, the Western-hating, Jew-defiling ideology that first formed in the perfervid and paranoid imagination of Sayyid Qutb, who in the early 1950s published his pamphlet entitled Our Fight with the Jews, eerily echoing Hitler's Mein Kampf. With the rise of Nazism and the massive influx of Jewish immigrants into Arab lands, influential Muslim leaders eagerly embraced the seemingly salvational nostrum pitched by Hitler, the Nazi promise that the Jewish infection would be finally and fully cauterized. The Mufti of Jerusalem, Amin al-Husseini, reached out to Adolf Hitler, spending the years 1941 to 1945 as the Führer's feted guest in Berlin. The Mufti broadcast radio speeches back to the Arab homeland, intertwining the Jewish hatred, inspiring German Nazis and Arab Muslims, and heralding Nazi military triumphs in North Africa and the Middle East. Nazi Einsatzgruppen, technocrats, worked with Islamist leaders in Berlin and North Africa to design concentration and death camps, where after the Nazi victory, a second final solution to the Jewish question would be carried out in the Muslim world. When the Nazis were defeated and the dream of exterminating all the world's Jews was lost, the victim position of Arab Muslims was confirmed. The victorious Israeli army became framed as perpetrators of, quote, the destruction, or Nakba, a trope that henceforth would allow Palestinian Arabs to experience the creation of Israel as their own Holocaust. After their Nakba and the Israeli expulsions, a diaspora of Palestinian exiles carried this history of their genocide into Europe. The universalization of the Holocaust trope had, for both Israelis and Palestinians, a devastatingly particularistic effect, helping shape two intensely antagonistic experiences of trauma drama. Two peoples with claims to the same land, each fighting for its very life in its own view, and sharing the same story of suffering, extermination, and revenge. The Islamist revolution in Iran fervently carried forward this anti-Jewish, Israel-hating version of the Holocaust story, organizing violently anti-Semitic appendages in Hamas and Hezbollah, radical political and military organizations dedicated to cleansing the Muslim Holy Land of Jews from the river to the sea. Supported by the cultural labor of intellectuals like Edward Said, novelists like Elias Khoury, and filmmakers like Mohammed Bakri, the identity of the orientalized, denigrated, despised, outcast, and terrorized Palestinian subject defined a new kind of post-Holocaust identity. Even as Israel deepened its aggressive occupation of the West Bank, the Palestinian version of its own Holocaust, about its struggle for anti-colonial, anti-white, anti-European, anti-American, anti-Christian, and above all, anti-Jewish liberation, gradually gained hegemony over the Jewish version of its own historical experience. The Palestinian liberation story began to powerfully appeal to significant segments of the Western audience, especially to progressive activists in the third generation. It was laminated, after all, onto the series of earlier heroically progressive struggles against religious, racial, sexual, and colonial domination, struggles that themselves had been framed inside the trope of genocide and had gradually displaced the historical memory of Nazism and its Jewish victims. That memory of the original historical Holocaust was briefly recalled on October 7th, 2023, by the Hamas massacre of almost 1,300 Jewish innocents on the Israeli side of the Gazan border. It was swiftly displaced by the tens of thousands of Palestinian innocents killed in the months of ferocious Israeli revenge and defense that followed. Corpses of encaged Gazans filled the television screens. Wailing mothers holding their dead and bleeding children, recalling Anne Frank, permeated the media, personalizing Palestinian suffering, triggering sympathetic identification with the victims of mass murder and angry indignation against Israeli perpetrators. Western liberals were conscience-stricken, as their parents and grandparents had been 75 years before. They were imaginatively reliving the terror of the Holocaust story, extending its universalizing moral frame. For majorities in Israel and the Arab Muslim world, and a growing segment of the Western liberal conscience, no extension of this universalism was possible. The warring sides had become desensitized to one another's suffering, each living out their collective nightmares of singular oppression and violent entitlement. On the left, a consensus emerged that Israel was committing genocide against a polluted, powerless, and excluded minority. No matter that the Palestinian innocents had been placed in harm's way as a human shield for Hamas fighters hiding in tunnels below. Once again, anti-Jewish violence had come to be experienced as liberation by an anti-Semitic movement. Judith Butler protested against the very idea that October 7th was, quote, a terrorist or anti-Semitic attack, insisting that what Hamas did must be understood rather as, quote, an uprising, quote, an act of armed resistance. In a lawsuit challenging his suspension from Columbia University, not for leading provocatively disruptive pro-Palestinian demonstrations, but for declaring during the protests that, quote, Zionists don't deserve to live, a student leader alleges that Columbia, quote, privileges a class of self-described Zionist Jewish people over everyone else on campus. Is it surprising that in the midst of this consternating and mind-numbing pathos, observant Jews, especially in Europe, have become afraid to display their religious identities in public? That in the midst of militantly anti-Israeli demonstrations, Jewish students in America have hunkered down inside their dormitories rather than face taunts, bullying, and sometimes physical abuse walking through the public spaces of their college campuses? That the categories of Israeli and Jew are becoming increasingly conflated? That left and right-wing anti-Semitic shibboleths about Jews, which have been shut down for decades, have begun now to re-enter into the Western mainstream. A significant segment of today's left has been deeply compromised by a stridently anti-Zionist discourse, which during this year of Gaza has frequently been seen as implicitly pro-Hamas. But in the West today, the liberal left is on its back foot, while it is the far right that is gathering steam. If this right-wing backlash were to triumph, Jews would be in deep trouble, along with other minorities and liberals as well. Feelings of solidarity would become further shredded, and the civil sphere of Western societies would be destroyed. There would be no place to hide. In the meantime, Jews committed to the continued existence of a democratic, if flawed, Israel must hold their tongues. And Jews who wish to publicly display their religious loyalties are forced to live in fear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for sketching this large-scale framework of understanding these issues. I will step down a few steps on the ladder of abstraction, so to speak, and I will have something to say about what has happened after October 7th last year in Scandinavia. So what has happened in terms of anti-Semitic manifestations and its impact on the Jewish communities, but most importantly, the political response. So how a democratic society deals with rising anti-Semitism can be seen as a litmus test, I think, of its genuine commitment to liberal democratic values. Because Jews are a paradigmatic minority, and anti-Semitism is a paradigmatic form of out-group prejudice and intolerance. So when the pressure builds up against Jews, then democratic countries have to show what they're made of. Scandinavian commitment to these democratic ideals of diversity and inclusion was put to the test following the Hamas massacre on October 7 last year and the sharp rise in anti-Semitic hostility that ensued. So how did we do, is my question. How did we pass the test? And in this talk I will present like a preliminary assessment based on my own observations and research. And I have three main claims to make. The first is that the expressions of anti-Semitic hostility that followed October 7 were quite similar in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Secondly, the impact on the Jewish minorities also seems to have been quite broadly similar. However, the third point is that the political response to these events and to these developments differed quite significantly. So I will expand a bit on each of those claims. So first, regarding the expressions, we saw that anti-Semitic incidents of harassment, threats, vandalism, and sometimes violence rose quite sharply across Scandinavia after October 7th. So in Norway, 2023 saw a threefold increase in police-recorded anti-Semitic hate crimes. A threefold increase compared to the previous 5 years, which is quite dramatic. In Sweden, there was also a sharp rise, and the same pattern was found in Denmark. Not only these incidents, you have also the hardening of the discursive climate, perhaps most visibly on social media, where the algorithms reward content that is strongly emotional and polarizing. And all of this became a major source of concern and worry and fear among the Jewish minorities in the Scandinavian countries. So in a survey among Jews in Norway, carried out in November last year, 8 in 10 said that their experiences after October 7th had led them to question whether Norway is a safe country for Jews. In a Swedish survey, 8 in 10, similar percentage, said that it felt unsafe to wear Jewish symbols openly. And about half of the respondents in Sweden said that they had discussed emigration. There's no similar survey from Denmark as far as I've seen, but the impact appears to have been similar, and we see media reports from the Danish context in which parents are telling their children not to let others know that they are Jews. So it seems that the manifestations and the impact have been quite similar across Scandinavia. So the question is, what then about the political response? So here I will be somewhat unpatriotic, as I believe that our Swedish and Danish neighbors have done a better job than we have in Norway. In Sweden, the center-right government, headed by Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson of the liberal conservative Moderaterna, has been very clear and loud and determined in condemning anti-Semitism in Sweden and voicing support for the Jewish community. So he made multiple public statements, wrote op-eds, and made several symbolic visits to Jewish sites in the months following October 7th. On November 8th, he published a particularly strong op-ed calling anti-Semitism in Sweden a disgrace to our country. Quite strong words. On December 6th, in Sweden, leaders of all the parties in the Swedish parliament, except the far-right Sweden Democrats, participated in a public Kippa march in solidarity with the Jewish community. So both Kristersson and Magdalena Andersson, the head of the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, and also the parliamentary opposition, took part in this event, and both of them spoke during the event. And Magdalena Andersson spoke of the Jewish life in Sweden as, a quote, an inalienable part of our society. And she called for a principled and vigorous fight against anti-Semitism in all its forms. This kind of language and public engagement was quite representative of the political response in Sweden. So moving to Denmark, Denmark's government, headed by Mette Frederiksen of the Social Democrats, responded quite similarly to the Swedish government. So for instance, on October 13, Frederiksen spoke during a commemoration event in Copenhagen's Great Synagogue, where the Queen of Denmark was also present. And the Prime Minister stated, I quote, "I assure you that you are not alone in these difficult times. Danish Jews will never be left alone. You should know that Denmark is with you. We grieve with you, and we share your pain. I am deeply moved by this tragedy that has befallen Israel and Jews the world over." So strong words and expressions, and numerous similar remarks were made by her on many occasions since, including on November 9 on the commemoration of the Kristallnacht pogrom, and in the New Year's speech, and in other events. So we should have had a Danish colleague to speak here today, and he told me that one of his main points would have been to say that in general, official Denmark, and also big parts of civil society, have embraced the Jewish minority's well-being as a core civil value, as a badge of honor for Denmark. So not just the Prime Minister, but party leaders from left to right, and also church officials and various civil society organizations have joined forces in condemning anti-Semitism as uncivil and as un-Danish, something that we will absolutely not tolerate in our country, with strong language and multiple of these public statements. So on the political level then, the Swedish and Danish responses seem to have passed the test. So what about Norway? The central-left government, headed by Prime Minister Støre of the Labour Party, also signaled some support for the troubled Norwegian Jewish community in the wake of October 7th. However, in my assessment, the messaging was less clear, less explicit, without the same emphasis and urgency that very much characterized the Swedish and Danish political leadership in this respect. So on October 20, Støre made his first official visit to the synagogue in Oslo after the attack, and then he also immediately afterwards visited the mosque, so with the purpose of hearing how, quote, "hearing how Norwegian Jews and Muslims experience the situation in the Middle East." And he stated here that both anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hostility must be fought. On November 4, the government in Norway announced that it would renew its action plan against anti-Semitism in 2024. We haven't seen this happen yet, but looking forward to this in the next couple of months to see what is coming out of this. But in any case, back in 2023, there was a press release in which the Minister for Local Government stressed quite clearly that fighting anti-Semitism is not the Jews' responsibility, it's a responsibility of the society as a whole. And he also said that the government does not want the tense situation to reduce the safety of Palestinians in Norway or Jewish Norwegians. It seems to be that it's impossible to focus on the specific situation of Jews without also bringing in other groups. A few days later, in November, the Foreign Minister, Smart Eide, also visited the synagogue, and he made a statement which was, to his credit, quite clear. He said that there is no doubt that we need an increased effort to combat anti-Semitism in Norway. And he said Jews in Norway feel alone, and that they feel that it is not legitimate to mourn because of the situation in the Middle East. And we can never tolerate that Jews in Norway should feel unsafe. So there was those statements too. But looking at the Prime Minister, he used his Facebook page quite a lot to make statements in different regards, and also after the October 7 attacks and the ensuing war, he made multiple statements, but not a single post addressing the situation for Jews in Norway. And there was one post on November 9th mentioning the 1938 Kristallnacht pogrom. And this post, however, surprisingly to me when I went back and read it, mentioned neither the October 7 massacre nor the wave of anti-Semitism threatening Jews in Norway and elsewhere. Instead, the text focused on the brutal war in the Middle East, quote, and the civilian suffering in Gaza. And I should also mention, which will be no news to any of you, I suppose. But after March 8th, the Women's Day, when a group of Jewish women who tried to join the demonstration to show solidarity with female Jewish victims of sexual violence were harassed and excluded from the demonstration, and there was basically no visible, at least, public response from the political leadership after this incident. So I would say that all in all, the Norwegian government did offer some support for the Jewish minority in the face of rising pressure, and we shouldn't forget the financial support for security measures around the synagogue and also more recently for the Jewish Museum of Oslo. But however, compared to Sweden and Denmark, I would say that the public statements and actions were lower in quantity, quality, and public visibility. So while there was a sense of heartfelt solidarity shining through in the words and deeds of leading Swedish and Danish politicians, the Norwegian government's expression has been brief, aloof, and often couched in general terms, instead of specifically addressing the specific situation for the Jewish minority. Perhaps most strikingly to me was that the Kristallnacht commemoration passed without any public appearance or strong statement from the government addressing the challenges facing the minority. So all things considered, I would say that our political leadership did not do well on this test compared to our Swedish and Danish neighbors. And we can discuss this further, perhaps in the discussion, the causes of this difference. But I think one important point is that Norway's lackluster response to anti-Semitism at home appears linked to its foreign policy stance. So on October 9, you know, the King of Norway was instructed by the Foreign Ministry not to issue condolences to Israel, quote, due to the political nature of the conflict. Moreover, on October 27, Norway, as the only Scandinavian country, voted for an Arab-drafted UN General Assembly resolution calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, but failed to condemn or even mention Hamas, the October 7 massacre, or the hostages. So it is possible that the government spotted an opportunity to renew Norway's role as a peace mediator and feared alienating Palestinians and Arabs by signaling a pro-Israel position. Given that much current anti-Semitism is linked to hostility towards Israel and Zionism, it's likely that the foreign policy ambitions may have come in the way of a forceful stance against anti-Semitism. Surely there are other causes too. Underlying sympathy with the Palestinian cause, which has been traditionally strong in the labor movement, also an aversion to the Jewish state that has become quite strong in public opinion in Norway, which is likely also tied, I would venture to suggest, likely also tied to what a very large proportion of Norwegian Jews, which is a result of several surveys that have been carried out in the past year, what a very large proportion see as a strongly one-sided narrative in the media coverage of the conflict. So these are issues that I think should be discussed further and perhaps researched further as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes, and thank you also, Jeffrey Alexander, for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor to be here today. It was a very dignified commemorative event yesterday. And I'm also honored to share some of my assessment of what went wrong. Because the Dane that was supposed to be here today, Jacob, he said that in Denmark, the protection of Jewish life and security is a core Danish national identity. And the question I would ask today in 2024, is the protection of Norwegian Jewish life and security a core national identity value in Norway? And of course, we all want the answer to be yes. But as also Johannes said, I think there's unfortunately a gap between ideal and practice that we witnessed the past year. So my talk will focus on the current trends and challenges with preventing and countering anti-Semitism. And this was also part of the mandate we were given by the government. I was heading the Commission on Extremism, mandated to give strategies for how we can prevent extremism and radicalization, including anti-Semitism. And I acknowledge that the government has its own action plan against anti-Semitism. So I will focus on how we in the Commission also analyze the threat landscape post-October the 7th, and also my own analysis following the period of submission of the report in March this year. Norway has a very dark and long history of anti-Semitism, and I want to acknowledge that we're standing here in the Wergeland space. Article 2 of the Norwegian Constitution of 1814 that stated that Jews were to be denied access to Norway. And the anti-Jewish paragraph was repealed from the Constitution in 1851 following a campaign mounted by Henrik Wergeland. Research into anti-Semitism in Norway has actually, historically speaking, been quite new. The past 2 decades, we've seen research from the Holocaust Center documenting how Norwegians took part in the deportation and the murder of Jews, the confiscation of Jewish property, financial liquidization, anti-Semitism circulating in the press. And there's also high awareness in the general Norwegian public about the atrocities of the Shoah, the Holocaust, including its devastating impact on the Norwegian Jewish community. Genocide is in living memory of several families in this country. So what is the threat landscape today? And I think that's also the explanation of the collapse in terms of the response to 7th of October in Norway, is you have a public that might be able to identify old historical anti-Semitism. But in terms of Israeli-related anti-Semitism and the so-called modern anti-Semitism, their knowledge and level of knowledge is lower. And we see how research and attitudinal surveys as well show how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for long has been a central reference for modern anti-Semitism. My own research into Jewish life in 21st century Norway also showed that young Norwegian adults feel very often when their Jewishness is revealed that they're subjected to a political test. Israeliness is conflated with Jewishness, and where are you on the Netanyahu scale? And you're only good enough a Jew if you denounce Zionism. And as we know, the only synagogue in Oslo is Zionist. And nuances on the ground and also in Israeli sociology and debate and reality about various streams of Zionism, liberal Zionism, post-Zionism, don't make it to Norwegian discourse. So there's a lack of complexity and nuances in that translation from the reality and how that also impacts Norwegian Jewish identity. Secondly, it's a very low knowledge about the centrality of Israel also in terms of emotions. So one thing is being subjected to political test, but that is also fine to have emotional attachments to Israel. As we said also before this event, we know that not all forms of Israeli-related anti-Semitism, you can critique Israel, it can be very powerful, strong, double-sided, whatever, but you crosses the line when you use classical anti-Semitic stereotypes, dehumanizing or keeping all Jews responsible for Israeli actions. So that's one of my points, that we need more knowledge about this, and it also needs to come into across different sectors. So who are the super spreaders of anti-Semitism in Norway today? In the Commission, we were mandated to look both at the extreme actors, but also at attitudes and actions that are designed to undermine democracy and human rights. So one was focusing on the reason why the threat level is lifted today, the police security service mandate. If the terrorist threats to Norwegian Jews or Israeli institutions is the police security mandated response to provide that security. And in terms of terrorist threats, we see that they are emanating from extreme Islamists and right-wing extremists. And I would say that what ties both of those milieux together is, of course, anti-Semitism. We had several terrorist attacks in Norway. The 2006 shooting against the synagogue was not classified as terrorism, but it's still an act of hate crime. It was the extreme Islamist was convicted. But my point is, even in white supremacy attacks on a mosque in Bærum inspired by the Christchurch shooter, you see at the core is Holocaust denial, anti-Semitism, and the belief that Jews are the ultimate evil, working to obtain global dominance and control. And it's driving also attacks on, we've seen in synagogues the very same movement, and also on Erev Yom Kippur. We also see a new trend when post-7th of October, actors from the extreme Islamist movement and from right-wing extremist white supremacy milieus are eclectically mixing ideologies and retweeting and co-producing enemy images. So you would have a white supremacy accelerationist movement retweeting Hamas propaganda, calling for total Jewish death, unquote. We also see how in Europe the Israel-Palestine conflict has for a long time been a partial motivation for jihadi violence, extremism, and terror directed at Jews. But what's important in terms of analyzing the collapse in the Norwegian response is that it's not just the fringe environments that the police security service have on the radar. What we've seen is also how anti-Semitism has been produced, propagated, and spread from the so-called midst, the majority that is supposed to hold the civil sphere and provide protection for minority rights, life, and thriving. And I'm thinking here about of the spread of anti-Semitic stereotypes from mainstream media, from editorials, from influencers, from musicians, media personalities, and sometimes also with the defense, oh, it's just being anti-Zionist, no Zionists in our street. So in my analysis, I think it's the lack of knowledge as well of how the Israeli-related anti-Semitism manifests that also explains these varying tendencies. I will not mention the rabbi in the synagogue yesterday said there's been a tsunami of anti-Semitism. And no, whether you use the ADL definition or the ERA definition or the Jerusalem Declaration, according to all the different definitions, by any chance we do see a very varying rise in anti-Semitism, both in terms of hate speech, harassment, physical assault, and terror plotting. So it is a dire situation. And I think dire situations, without being alarmistic, calls for also firm action and response. And to go to some of the recommendations we are issuing in the report, and I would actually raise the first issue because we are an independent commission consisting of 70 members, different backgrounds, different sectors, academia, law enforcement, civil society, religious leaders, and issuing recommendations. And we also went to Denmark, and what I took away from Denmark is also being a bit more action-oriented, because we have now lots of government reports, of Norwegian public reports, pointing to structural vulnerabilities, pointing to the lack of structures for sharing information, pointing to the lack of knowledge in important sectors. But still, we issued, and I'm very proud of the 40 recommendations, that we need the structures for knowledge enhancing. First and foremost, we also need governments that denounce anti-Semitism swiftly and clearly. And we know if you don't have leaders that denounce anti-Semitism swiftly and clearly, you will have that space that is potentially re-traumatizing. The silence. And when you hear that shocking number of 50 people, 50% not enlisting, is it safe to say? It's not, my homeland, shall I plan immigration? That sense of shattered safety means that the Norwegian majoritarian society has failed, unfortunately. In order to also combat anti-Semitism, we need tools to understand the manifestations, so we recommend continued research. We also recommend enhancing education about the issue. We support the Jewish Pathfinder program, which is well in place, but we know it's not the responsibility of minorities themselves to combat prejudice against minorities. So we also we recommend to systematize and strengthen the work in fostering democratic resilience through education in human rights and also democracy. Because sometimes it's difficult to measure the work of prevention work. But we know the value of interfaith dialogue. We know the value of being exposed to critical thinking in terms of denouncing anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. And these are also some of the recommendations. We also support, for instance, the DEMBRA program. Can you lift a hand? There you are, the DEMBRA program, which is a great program on fostering democratic resilience to racism and anti-Semitism. But the challenge, as we also write, you're not reaching enough people. So we want DEMBRA out in all schools, and we also want the tools you're making now for how, when we know that anti-Semitism is informed by violent escalations elsewhere in the Middle East or the Israel-Hamas war, you have mediatized pain in the smartphone in the pocket of kids. We need tools in schools, and we also need teachers that manages to really, really deal in this country of conformity with a community of disagreement. So when we say an issue, cultivate a whole of society approach, eradicating anti-Semitism requires a whole of society commitment. It requires that governments step up, but also most importantly, also the acts of engaged ordinary citizens that are doing their work also in everyday life. But to do their work in everyday life, you need knowledge. And in a country like Norway, with a tiny minority, not all Norwegians have ever met a Jew even, it's vital and important. Because anti-Semitism is not solely a threat to Jews, it can endanger members of other minority groups, democratic values, and social cohesion. So thank you.
Thank you, Cathrine. Thank you, Johannes, and thank you, Jeffrey. These have been very valuable and thought-provoking talks, and they really call for discussion. And to do so,